evening. Welcome to this great event we're going to have tonight, looking at Canada's wildlife. So welcome, come on in, and yeah, do tell us in the chat box where you're joining us from. That would be brilliant. So welcome everybody, and we're really looking forward here to this special event this evening, where we're looking at Canada and its wildlife in particular. So I see we've got people joining us tonight from Kent, Farnham, Dublin, Denmark, Malta, Cardiff, Bournemouth, Chester, Brighton. So yeah, everybody really coming in now from all over the UK, Manchester, West Yorkshire, Nottingham, Billericay, Rottingdean, and coming in far too far to pick out names, but oh gosh. And yeah, somebody's got sun currently in Quebec. Oh, dark and damp in Kent. Yes, oh dear. Hello from Malta. That's Louise. Somebody from Burnley, the happy place. Inverness in Scotland, North Yorkshire, West Yorkshire. Somebody down the road from Windsor. I'm in Windsor as well. Hello from Pennsylvania, USA. Hello, Guri. And hi from Helsinki. So welcome. Somebody else
just got back from there.
From the USA. Oh, have you? Helsinki. Somebody from Milwaukee. Welcome, everybody. Sorry, I can't read your names out. It's all far too fast. I can't pronounce half of them as well. So, because hello to Boggy from Hungary. Welcome. Martin from Essex, currently in Whitby. And Ali, lovely. Thank you so much. Liz from Bristol, Jackie from Burnham Butts, just down the road. I used to live in Burnham. And Elizabeth from Amersham, welcome. Veronica from Argentina. See, we're covering the world tonight. So welcome. I hope you're all comfy with a drink. Somebody from Canada, hurrah! Jane from Ontario. And we've got Ruben and Anna from Manchester in England. Somebody from Istanbul. Hello, Taylor. Welcome. Carol in Norfolk. Susie in London. Welcome. Maureen from Spain. Jane Cornwall. Lovely to have you all join us tonight. I think this is going to be a super event. Really looking forward to this. Hello, Steve from Maidstone. Chris from Manchester. So, yes, hope you're all getting yourself comfy, settling down. We're going to have an hour and a quarter of fantastic content this evening. Julia from Vancouver Island. Oh gosh,
lucky Julia.
Hello, Julia.
Yeah, we were all talking earlier before we went live about where we want to live, and I think Vancouver Island's very high on our wish list.
Yep.
Hello to Sue from Kyoto, to Trusha from Northwest London. Sorry if I'm mispronouncing names as well. Chris from Epsom. Yolanda from Zurich in Switzerland. So welcome. Make yourselves comfy. Hope you've got a drink to hand. And I hope you're in the mood for some great stories and images of wildlife in Canada. I think this is going to be so exciting. And I'll be introducing you to the speakers in a moment, where it always takes a bit of time with so many people for everybody to come in. Hello to Susan from Vancouver. Jane from Oxford, and Doug from Gozo. Oh, the consequence of one of our earlier events. Yes, we did an event about Malta and Gozo. So, Doug, that's obviously why you're there, which is fantastic. Hello to Rose from Chichester. So, have we got a question already, team? Is Prince Edward Island a good place to visit? Well, I'm sure we'll be answering that. And yes. So just to explain what's going to happen this evening, I'm Lynn Hughes, the founding editor of Wanderlust. I'm going to introduce you to our incredible speakers in a moment. And we are going to have a couple of great talks tonight. First of all, on whales, and then on bears, in particular by our experts. We're going to finish off the evening with a Q&A. So we'll be taking note of your questions during the evening. You know, if you want to put them in the chat box, And we may well also be answering some of those as we go along, but we'll definitely have time at the end for a Q&A. And of course, this evening's brought to us by a brilliant tour company who I've travelled with myself, Discover the World. We're always happy to partner with Discover the World because they do so many amazing trips. And so we did do a draw. You could opt in to have a chance of winning a Discover the World gift voucher of £100 to spend towards your travels. And so we'll be announcing the winner of that. Probably during the Q&A, we'll announce that winner. So do stay on for that. We always get asked as well, is there going to be a recording of the event in case you get interrupted, you have to leave early, whatever? Yes, there will be a recording of the event. And we'll be sending out a follow-up email in a day or two with that link. And also with perhaps some of the questions that were asked and any place names or anything we think is worth mentioning in that follow-up email. So don't worry about that. We've got somebody else join us from Canada, Francois. So welcome, Francois. And to Lisa from Spain, Robert from Cambridge. So yes, as we said, we've got people here from all over. So let me introduce you to our incredible speakers tonight. And first of all, I think a lot of you will be familiar with him, and he has indeed spoken on a member exclusive event before if you're one of our members. But first of all, it's Mark Carwardine, who welcome, Mark. Mark's a zoologist, environmental activist, award-winning writer, a TV and radio presenter. You may have seen him over the years in, lots of TV programs, but including Last Chance to See. And he's a widely published wildlife photographer, best-selling author, and he's also a tour operator and leader himself, a lecturer and a magazine columnist. Mark's also the author of more than 50 books, which is absolutely incredible. I mean, that's so hard to believe. Not that it's hard to believe, Mark, that you can't write, of course. Sorry, I always have to josh with Mark.
I wasn't going to say anything. I was going to let that pass.
No, Mark's written some fantastic books. I've got some of them here, in fact, in my bookcase behind me.
Oh.
And so that includes Mark Carwardine's Guide to Whale Watching in North America. And Mark's most recent book is the Handbook of Whales, Dolphins and Porpoises, which is the most comprehensive and up-to-date guide to the world's cetaceans. And Mark, that was a labour of love, wasn't it? How long did that take you?
Oh, my God. Well, the original contract gave me a year. I was just 5 years late in delivering the manuscript. So 6 years altogether, not full-time, but dominating my life for 6 years. And, I would definitely recommend the life lesson I learned doing that is never, ever, ever write a handbook or field guide or anything like that at all. It's very satisfying at the end, but oh my God, it's hard work.
Yes, a real labour of love. And I remember you telling me about the difficulties of doing that. But yeah, new species and subspecies and everything happening all the time, all the debates about what makes a subspecies. So as you'll have gathered, Mark really is the expert, the world's expert probably on whales, dolphins and cetaceans generally. And then we're also delighted to welcome Melanie Clapham. Hey, Mel.
Hi.
So Melanie works within the fields of behavioural ecology and large carnivore conservation. And her academic research is focused on developing our understanding of bear behaviour. And Mel's also co-director and conservation scientist Bear ID project, which I know we'll be hearing about in a bit.
Yes.
And Mel also works closely with Night Inlet Lodge, one of Canada's top bear watching lodges, which is so high on my bucket list, Mel, just dropping a hint.
Oh, you should come visit. Absolutely. We'd love to have
you. I've wanted to for years. I came so close once, but that's another story. And so Mel is working with them to assess and reduce the impacts of commercial wildlife watching. So really looking forward to your talk, Melanie. I think that's going to be tremendous. So great. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Lynn. Thanks for inviting me.
Ooh. And then we've also been joined by Liz Lunnon, who's the head of product at Discover the World. And Liz's first Canadian adventure was a summer in Banff in 1998, where she hiked and paddled in the shadow of the Rockies daily before setting off the country to canoe across the lakes. And so Canada's epic landscapes and fascinating wildlife made an indelible impression. And since then, Liz has made countless return visits rather. And I say encounters because, Liz, you listed your most memorable wildlife experiences in Canada for me. And you know what? All three of those are I've had as well, and they were just incredible. So kayaking with curious belugas in the Canadian Arctic, yeah, fantastic. Watching humpbacks breach amongst icebergs off the coast of Newfoundland, yes, absolutely. And close encounters with the grizzlies of the Great Bear Rainforest, yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, very, very different and very, very special in their own way. So, and that's the great thing about Canada. You know, every time you go back, it's just a completely different, different landscape, different experience wherever you go in the country. So.
It really is. And of course, yeah, and it's wherever you're going seems in Canada as well. There is just so much there. Mm-hmm. So fantastic. So Liz is going to be joining us for the Q&A at the end. So do get your questions, do fire them in. And I don't know, Liz might even be able to answer some of you in the chat box as well as we go along.
Try.
So, yeah, so that's what's happening. So in a few minutes, we're going to go over to Mark, then we're going to go to Melanie, then we'll have the Q&A. So do hang around for the whole thing. But first of all, just to get us in the mood, we're going to have a very short but very lovely video.
See the world, hear the world, discover the world. Authentic holidays for passionate travellers.
Great. I said it was short, but wasn't it wonderful? Real kind of little sensory experience there. So really fantastic. So welcome back, Mark. And we're now going to hear from Mark about whale watching in Canada. And I'm just so ridiculously excited about this. So
you've seen a lot of whales over the years, haven't you?
I have. I've been whale watching with you indeed several times. Yeah. But yeah, Canada is probably where I've done the most whale watching of all.
Oh, right. Oh, that's good.
Yeah, I just know how incredible it is as a whale watching destination. So really looking forward to this. So I'll leave you to it.
Great. Thank you very much. Thank you. Okay, let me just get all this lined up. So, well, it's a real pleasure to be doing this, I have to say, because I'm talking about two of my favourite things, whale watching and Canada. We were just talking before we started about where we would most like to live, and my honest answer would be Canada. There's so much fantastic wildlife there. And I have to say, I've missed it, because of the pandemic. I normally see whales, I don't know, pretty much every week of the year. So haven't seen one for a long time. I guess the next best thing is to talk about them. So that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to try and do it justice. I've just got 20 minutes raving about one of the prime whale watching locations anywhere in the world. So I'll see if I can do it justice and do it well. This is where I'd like to live. And we were just talking with Mel, who you'll be hearing from in a minute. And she was saying she lives on Vancouver Island, overlooking the Juan de Fuca Strait, and can see killer whales sometimes from her house. And I've never been anywhere in the world where there are more houses where you can actually watch whales from the house. I mean, what an amazing place to be locked down during a pandemic. You look out of the kitchen window and you can see a humpback whale like this. It's absolutely phenomenal. So this is where it all started. This is this is Howe Sound, and it's actually in Canada where whale watching began. We're talking, early 1900s, that sort of time. And there were a lot of humpback whales in Howe Sound, which is just north of Vancouver Island. And they were gathered there during the summer. And they actually ran whale watching trips from Vancouver into Howe Sound specifically to see humpbacks. That's the first time anybody had ever done it. Sadly, the enterprise didn't last for that long, to be honest, because there were whalers round the corner. And when they heard about the humpbacks, they went into Howe Sound and killed all the whales. So sadly, it only lasted for a few years. But that was where the whole thing began. And of course, it's taken off since then, as a worldwide thing. We're talking, I think the latest count, something like 13 million people go whale watching around the world every year in 119 different destinations, different countries and independent territories. And Canada is one of the prime destinations where large numbers of people go every year. So let me give a little brief overview of what we're talking about and where we're talking. So here we are, here's Canada. If I just run through very briefly some of the real hotspots. And there's whale watching on both the Pacific side and the Atlantic side, in the Arctic and the subarctic. No whale watching in the lakes, even though Canada's got these huge lakes. That's not as daft as it sounds, because there are seals in lakes. So, for example, in Lake Baikal in Russia, there's the Baikal seal, and it only lives in that freshwater lake, but there's no whales. Anyway, so all the coasts have whale watching of different kinds. So just to give you an idea, down there on the bottom left is Vancouver Island, of course, and that is one of the best places in the world for whale watching. The focus is mostly on killer whales, and I'll talk a bit about that in a minute, in the area between Vancouver Island and the mainland. But it's also whale watching off the west coast. There's grey whales migrating past, and humpback whales and that kind of thing. A little bit further north from there, this is Haida Gwaii, or Queen Charlotte Islands as it used to be. And of course, the Great Bay Rainforest that Mel's going to be talking about. I'll try not to rave about that. It's one of my favourite places on the planet. Mel's talking about bears, but it's also fantastic for whale watching. So you've got fin whales, humpback whales, killer whales, Dall's porpoises, Pacific white-sided dolphins, all that kind of thing. It's a fantastic area for wildlife generally, but I'll try and keep quiet about that. Now, if you look there, that's Hudson Bay, over up in the other side. Churchill is the real focus. There's whale watching in different parts of Hudson Bay, but Churchill is the real focus. Churchill, of course, is better known as the polar bear capital of the world. And that's the reason most people go there. But if you go in the summer, particularly sort of July and August, you've got a very good chance of seeing lots of beluga whales. And I've been there on a good day when, I mean, there are thousands of them on a good day. And you can look out over the Churchill River estuary, which is right next to the town, and you can see what looks like whitecaps, but it's literally hundreds or dozens at the very least of beluga whales all surfacing, and you see their white bodies. It's an amazing place for beluga whale watching. Now, moving up a little bit, Nunavut, which I'll talk a bit about in a moment, is a wonderful place for whale watching. There's lots of expedition cruise ships go through this region. That blob is on a place called Somerset Island, which is another great place for beluga whales. But anywhere around there, you can see all sorts of different species. And then moving around, we have Baffin Island, and that particular blob is on Fox Basin, which is another great hotspot, particularly for bowhead whales. And then Baffin itself. One place I'll talk about is I suppose if I had to pick one place, would be my favourite, would be Pond Inlet, which is at northern end of Baffin Island, and that is the best place on the planet to see narwhal. So I'll talk a little bit about that in a moment. So you see the sort of variety of whale watching opportunities around Canada. We've already mentioned Newfoundland. My first ever whale watching trip I ever ran was 32 years ago now, 1989, and that was off Newfoundland, humpback whale watching, and I still remember it now. It was such an amazing week. We had really bad weather, rough seas and everything, but we had humpback whales breaching like there's no tomorrow. Humpback whales gather there in big numbers along with other species to catch capelin, little silvery fish. And most of the whale watching trips focus on the humpbacks, but you could see all sorts of other species while you're there as well. So Newfoundland has some very, very fond memories for me. This is the Gulf of St. Lawrence and the St. Lawrence River estuary, another great hotspot. And in fact, Quebec is one of the largest whale watching destinations in the world in terms of numbers of people going. Is another fantastic place for belugas, which actually live in the river estuary. The Gulf of St. Lawrence is also fantastic for blue whales, and increasingly in recent years, as I'll talk about in a minute, for North Atlantic right whales. It's one of the few places in the world where you can see North Atlantic right whales on a regular basis. And just a couple more here. Bay of Fundy, which I will talk about in a minute, which is where the right whales used to be. They've actually moved further north, but that is fantastic for several other species. And a little place here, just on the right there, you can see the Gully, which is it's basically a submarine canyon off the coast of Nova Scotia in the middle of nowhere. Very difficult place to go to, unfortunately. There's no whale watching trips. You'd have to basically hire a boat from Sable Island, which is about 25 miles away. And a few expedition cruise ships do actually go there now. There's nothing there. It's in the middle of the ocean, but there is this deep submarine canyon, and it's a real sort of magnet for all different kinds of whales, but in particular for these. Now, this is a northern bottlenose whale, and it's probably the best place on the planet to see northern bottlenose whales. There's only, I'd say, about 140 of them living in the Gully. But if you do ever get a chance to go on one of these expedition cruise ships doing the east coast of Canada and it stops off at the Gully, do go, because you've got a very good chance of seeing one of these amazing, weird-looking whales. So this is a little collection of the species that you're most likely to see. Obviously, it's not all of them. You might see, I never say never with whale watching. You know, you can say, oh, you never get such and such a species here, and then the next thing you see is one of those. You know, they can turn up pretty much anywhere, but these are the ones you're most likely to see in Canada. And I've mentioned some of them already. The real highlights are the blues, killer whales, the bowheads, the North Atlantic right, the belugas, the narwhal, the northern bottlenose, and that little dot down there, bottom left, harbour porpoise. I'll tell you in a minute why, but I think Canada is the best place to see harbour porpoises as well, see them better than anywhere else in the world. And of course, you've got this spectacular setting. You know, I talked about watching whales from your kitchen window, but there's so much fantastic wilderness in Canada. This is in the Great Bear Rainforest, my only picture, because I don't want to overlap with Mel, but it's Mel's going to rave about bears, but it does have fantastic whales. And these are humpback whales. They've been bubble netting, and they come up through the surface with their mouths wide open, right in front of that spectacular Great Bear Rainforest. So it's not just the whales, it's the settings as well. So I'm going to start with here. This is on the east coast. This is the Bay of Fundy. Now, I picked three highlights, I think, because we've only got 20 minutes, which will show the variation, the varieties of whale watching in different parts of Canada. And you can have all sorts of amazing different experiences watching them from all sorts of different boats, different kinds of whale watching. You can kayak with them in some places. Lots of great land-based whale watching, as here in the Bay of Fundy. So this is sandwiched between Nova Scotia and New Brunswick. It's basically at the northern end of the Gulf of Maine, and it's a huge sort of semi-enclosed sea. So it's about 170 miles long, and anywhere between about 30 miles and 50 miles at its widest. And it's probably most famous, you may have heard of it, because it's got the highest tidal range of anywhere in the world. And the biggest range between high tide and low tide is actually about 55 feet. So it's a phenomenal tidal range. And that helps to produce an amazing upwelling, vigorous upwellings that bring all the nutrients up to the surface and provide lots of food. And that's why the Bay of Fundy is so rich in an amazing variety of wildlife. It's one of the great places for land-based whale watching. You can literally just stand there, look out to sea, and chances are you're going to see something interesting. Now, as I said a few minutes ago, it used to be the best place for North Atlantic right whales. These are really, really rare whales, the most endangered large whale in the world. I mean, at the last count, there were just 356 North Atlantic right whales left. And they've suffered literally 1,000 years of whaling. It's amazing there's any left at all, actually. They were very heavily hunted and nearly went extinct. The numbers have built back a little bit, but they seem to be declining again at the moment. So we're very fearful for the future of the North Atlantic right whale. Another one of the threats it faces is warming waters because of global warming. And the waters, we think what's happening in the Gulf of Maine and the Bay of Fundy, where they used to gather regularly every summer to feed, have been warming so much that the food is no longer there in sufficient quantities. So they seem to have moved north, which is why they're now being seen in the Gulf of St. Lawrence, further north around the corner. But you can sometimes see them in the Bay of Fundy, nothing like in the numbers you used to, but there's all sorts of other fantastic whales in the bay. This is another humpback whale close to shore. There you can see just up on the right there, another one of these amazing Canadian houses overlooking whales and fantastic wildlife. It reminds me, years ago, I interviewed a couple in Crystal River in Florida, and they had manatees at the bottom of their garden, an amazing place to live again. But they had this mirror on the ceiling above their bed at an angle, and they said that it was so they could lie in bed and watch the manatees at the bottom of the garden as they swam past. Don't need a mirror in that house. You can see the humpback whales right there. You've got fin whales as well, quite good numbers of fin whales, see them quite frequently. This is a minke whale. This is actually not so good. This is in a herring weir. And one of the problems in the Bay of Fundy is they have these herring weirs for the fishermen, and whales quite often get trapped in them. So a whale like a minke whale can swim around, it can breathe and so on, but it can't get out. And occasionally big whales like North Atlantic right whales and humpbacks will get trapped, and they just barge their way out and break through all the netting. You get little ones like harbour porpoises get trapped in there as well. And there's a big move in the Bay of Fundy to there's a rescue group that will actually go if you report whales in one of these weirs and go and let them out. Fishermen are being encouraged to do it as well. So I think sometimes the whales get caught in there quite frequently, the same whales, and they just wait to be released. They don't always get released, and some do die in there. But it's an amazing project to solve this problem, so the fishermen can still use the weirs and the whales don't get caught and killed. Bay of Fundy is also a fantastic place for watching Atlantic white-sided dolphins, one of the few places you can go and be pretty sure of seeing them. And as I said at the beginning, harbour porpoises. Now, they don't excite many whale watchers, sadly, because that's basically all you see of a harbour porpoise. In most parts of the world, you might hear a little puffing sound as it takes a breath, and then it disappears below the surface, and that's it, and it's gone. But in the Bay of Fundy, they seem to come out of the surface much higher. It's really interesting. I don't quite know why. You see them in little groups as well, whereas most parts of the world, harbour porpoise is just one, maybe two animals. But you get groups of 3, 4, 5, 6 in the Bay of Fundy, and you get them coming out like this, more like a dolphin. And I know if you're not into this kind of thing, this isn't spectacular, but this is a picture I got a couple of years ago. And I've been trying to photograph harbour porpoises in different parts of the world for many years. And that's the best shot I've got. It's the only one that shows the porpoise properly. And if you want to see them like that, the Bay of Fundy is the place to go. So let's move on to Vancouver Island, which is probably the most famous whale watching location in Canada if you had to pick one. Now, you get the whales, as I mentioned at the beginning, swimming past the west coast. You get migrating grey whales and lots of humpbacks. That's fantastic. What I'm going to talk about just briefly is the gap between Vancouver Island and the mainland. And there's two main whale watching areas. One is, if you look up in the north there in that blue bit, you might just be able to read Telegraph Cove. Well, that is one of the main centres up there. Where I go most often is down in the south, in the Salish Sea, which is that southern portion shared between Canada and the States. And you can see the area marked the Gulf Islands. Well, that area was shared with American islands just the other side of the border, the San Juan Islands. And you're whale watching in both countries. So the whale watch operator can actually, if you're following whales and they go from Canada to the States, you're allowed to follow them into the States as long as you don't drop anybody off in America, have to stay on the boat, and then you can come back, and vice versa, which is fantastic. And what it's best known for is killer whales. And they're fantastic killer whale watching there of 3 different what are called ecotypes. You've got residents that are eating fish, you have the transients that eat mainly marine mammals, and you have the offshores, which also eat fish, sharks and things like that, and in varying numbers. And it's a spectacular place to see them. And there's some very well-known individual whales there that researchers have been studying them since the 1970s, and they know many of the killer whales there individually. So there was one famous one I remember. I did actually see very briefly once, called Granny, and she was the oldest killer whale that we've ever known in the world. They reckon she celebrated her 105th birthday in 2016, and she used to be the matriarch of this pod of killer whales, and there were 5 generations in the pod. So she actually outlived her children, but in the pod were her grandchildren, great-grandchildren and great-great-grandchildren. And even at the age of 105, I saw her in 2016, and she was breaching, leaping out of, this isn't her, but she was leaping out of the water like that, which is amazing. She hasn't been seen since 2016, sadly, so I think she's probably passed away, but an amazing whale. It's a fantastic place to watch them from ferries as well. If you go on the BC Ferries going between all the islands and what have you, chance of seeing killer whales, if you stand out on deck instead of sitting in the cafe, are really quite high. And it's another great place for land-based whale watching too. There's all sorts of whale watch operations from all sorts of cities in that area, Vancouver and Victoria and Seattle, and lots of smaller towns and villages as well, all different sized boats. So you can basically take your pick of what sort of whale watch operation you want to go on. And lots of private boats as well. It is a bit of an issue. There are lots of people out there. And again, lots of great work being done to try and minimise the disturbance. The commercial whale watch operators, certainly from what I've seen, are normally very, very good at keeping a distance from the whales, reading the whales, working out where to wait so that the whales come to them and so on. The private boat is not so good. And there are these volunteer organisations that are out there dishing out leaflets and advising the private boaters how to manoeuvre around whales and telling them off if they're doing it badly. That guy there, I don't know what he's actually photographing, but he missed the whale. And there are so many there on a good day, you can actually find them in thick fog. The light this day was wonderful. The fog kept lifting and falling again. And it was bright sunshine most of the time. And you can actually just stop, even on a big boat like this, you can actually just stop and cut the engines and listen, and you can hear the whales blow. Then you creep forward a bit towards them and you stop again and listen, and you can gradually get to within sight of them. This was a killer whale on that lovely foggy day. I love the light. Light's critical in photography, and it's critical in whale photography just the same. And I love photographing whales looking into the sun. It shows, particularly with killer whales, it shows that amazing silhouette of the male. And it makes the blow stand out much better as well. Shooting into the sun, it just lights the blow up, especially if the background's dark. And it is all about the light. These are all killer whales in the Salish Sea, in that sort of same region between Canada and the States. All shooting in lovely light at the end of the day. This was on a trip a few years ago, and we'd chartered a small boat, and we took sandwiches and lunch out. We went out at first light and stayed out until dark. And the best whale watching was as the sun went down, just before it got dark. And it was so calm and peaceful, nobody else about. You could hear the whales blowing, and you could see these extraordinary orange, colourful blows. So finally, before I finish, I'd just like to talk about Baffin Island and Nunavut. Now, Nunavut up in Arctic Canada is a wonderful place for wildlife watching. This is, I mentioned this earlier, this is Somerset Island, Cunningham Inlet it's called. which is a great place for beluga whales. There's a camp you can see there right on the shoreline. And there are all sorts of places like that dotted around Nunavut. But I like to just end on Baffin Island, which is a wonderful place for scenery, landscapes and wildlife. Huge numbers of polar bears. If you go to Baffin Island, your chances of seeing polar bears are pretty good. It's also well known for walruses. There's some great walrus haul-outs in many parts of Baffin Island. This was actually in Fox Basin. And here we are in Fox Basin, which is just off the west coast of Baffin Island in the middle. And it's a really good spot for bowhead whales. One of the best places in the world for seeing bowhead whales. And we were out in boats and managed to find them pretty much every day we were there. They're extraordinary whales. It's the only large whale that lives exclusively in the Arctic. So in very thick ice, you can still find bowhead whales. And they're very well known for living to a ripe old age. So the local Inuit have always said that a bowhead whale can live 2 human lifetimes. And we know from the little we do know, you can actually age whales it's quite complicated, by the amino acids in the lenses of their eyes. And when whales are killed by whalers in the Arctic, they're sometimes studied for this and other things. And of 4 that were looked at specifically for their age, the oldest one, and it was killed while it was healthy by whalers, was 211 years old. So we know that they can live to at least 2 centuries, and who knows how much longer they might be able to live. It's just guesswork, maybe a lot longer than that. So amazing to think what some of these really old, this was a particularly old one. It had a very white tail, which is a sign of a much older whale. It's amazing to think what that whale might have lived through. But what I'd like to talk about is narwhal, which, again, if I had a gun held to my head and had to pick my favourite whale, I think it would be narwhal. It's the most extraordinary animal with this extraordinarily long tusk. And we don't still know exactly what the tusk is for. There have been all sorts of wonderful theories, grubbing around on the seabed for food or drilling holes in the ice. My favourite one is spearing small fish. But then you think about that, well, if you speared the fish, it needs a very long tongue to get the fish off to be able to eat it. I think the most likely explanation is it's a secondary sexual characteristic, normally only found in males, a bit like antlers in deer. So the best place to see them is if you look up at the top there, Pond Inlet. There we are, the little picture of a narwhal up there. That is the place to go. And if I had to say one place, if you want to see narwhal, go to Pond Inlet. It's a bit of a palaver getting there. You've got to fly from London to Ottawa to Iqaluit on Baffin Island, then Iqaluit all the way up to Pond Inlet, this little Inuit community on the north coast of Baffin Island. And then all you have to do from Pond Inlet is you have to get a skidoo, and there are trips that will drag you in a wooden sledge by skidoo. Depends on the ice, but 5 to 7 hours to skidoo from Pond Inlet to the ice edge. It's amazing, absolutely amazing journey. That's the sort of scene that you see along the way. So 5 to 7 hours just goes like that. And then you have a camp on the ice edge. Sometimes have to keep moving it if the ice breaks up and moves. A reasonably comfortable camp. And that's where you spend the week. And the idea is you basically just sit on the ice edge. And what happens is the narwhal are migrating in the spring as the ice breaks up, migrating north. And they want to go round Pond Inlet into a place called Eclipse Sound. And you're waiting for them to pass by. You have to be patient, and there's a few obvious hazards. That's one of them. The ice cracking up. This is another one. Polar bears will sometimes be asleep on the ice and they'll wash in or blow in. And when the ice hits our ice, if you like, this polar bear pops up, suddenly gets woken up. So there is a guard dog in the camp, although I have to say this particular guard dog was always the last to realise there was a polar bear around. All adds to the fun. But you basically wait. When I first went there, I waited for 10 days before I saw a narwhal. And, you know, you're all eager for the first day, a little bit less eager the next day, getting a bit tired the following day. Then you just wait for somebody to shout narwhal. But lots of other wildlife while you're waiting. Brunet's guillemots. This is a king eider swimming backwards and forwards along the ice edge all the time. That's a ruddy turnstone in front of one of our tents. And you just got to put the time in. And then eventually the narwhals started arriving. And first of all, you see a little bit of their backs, maybe 30 feet away from the ice edge, maybe a tail, just a tantalizing glimpse. Then you start to see a sign of a tusk. That's the male's tusk just under the surface there. And that's what you really want to see. And you start to see them lifting their tusks out of the water, and it makes that 13-day wait worth every minute. It's one of the most exciting wildlife experiences you can have, I think, to see a male narwhal swimming past where you're standing on the ice, lifting that amazing tusk out of the water. There's a young male. The tusk starts growing. It's basically an incisor. It starts growing and pierces through the upper lip when it's about 2 or 3 years old. So this is a young male, maybe 4 years old, something like that, with his little tusk just starting to develop. And that's my best shot so far. And I'm going to end on that picture because this is a work in progress. I'm never happy with any photograph I've ever taken. There's always some issue. I can always find fault with it. And of course, it's a really good excuse to go back. So one day I'm going to go back to Pond Inlet and try and do better. But as I say, if you want to see narwhal, that's the place to go. Well, I think I've talked long enough. I'll leave it there and pass back to Lynn. Thanks very much.
Oh, Mark. Oh, that was so fantastic. Absolutely wonderful. And lots of love for your photos, not surprisingly. And you've had some questions about the camera you use, what lens do you use. So I'm sure we can ask you those in the Q&A as well. And not surprisingly, lots of questions about when to see whales. I mean, we can save that for the Q&A. You can go into a bit more detail, perhaps, and summarise.
Yes.
Unless, do you think we should do it then?
I mean, most of it's in the summer. Spring and summer are the key seasons for all the places I've talked about. The whales are there in the winter in some cases, but like in the high Arctic, it's very hard to get there and to see them, of course. So generally speaking, you're talking from April through to October, with a few places with peak months like I would say Churchill, July, August is a peak month. But yeah, it's that period. So it's almost all summer whale watching. Yeah.
Okay, great. Question, what was the name of that whale with the tusk? That was narwhal, wasn't it?
Narwhal, yeah. Narwhal.
Yeah. I think, Tanner, we'll when we send out the follow-up email with the link, we'll list some of the species that Mark mentioned, because there was a lot to take in there. It's incredible. And I personally loved seeing, or you talking rather about Granny. I remember seeing Granny. And,
oh, have you seen Granny?
Yeah, was it J2? Was she?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
So that was wonderful. Okay.
Yeah, J2 is the scientist's name for her. Granny's a much better name.
Yeah, absolutely. We like real names. Well, thank you so much, Mark. And everybody, keep your questions coming in for Mark, because we will go to the Q&A once we've heard from Mel about bears. So thank you again, Mark. And let's welcome back Melanie.
Hello.
Hi, Melanie. See,
Hi.
We are so jealous. You live there. I mean, oh,
very lucky, I know. Yes, very, very lucky. We've only had whales past the house maybe twice, but it's incredible to see.
Yeah, really, well, even so, that's twice more than the majority of us have had whales go past our house. We'd probably be rather worried if whales go past our house. Yeah. But no, that was still fantastic. Mm-hmm. So welcome, Melanie. And of course, you, as we know, are an amazing bear conservationist. So we'll hand over to you to tell us a little bit more about bears.
Great. Thank you very much. Okay. Awesome. All right. Hi, everybody. Thanks, first of all, to Wanderlust and Discover the World for inviting me to come and talk to you this evening. And thanks to Mark also for a great talk. I think I'm going to add Pond Inlet to my bucket list now. That looks like an amazing place to visit. So I'm going to talk to you this evening about bears. Specifically, we're going to talk about grizzly bears because that's the species that I study. We're going to talk about some of the research that I do, the place where I work, and some of the conservation work that's going on there as well. So I just wanted to start off, first of all, with this image of a grizzly bear. This is a bear that I know, her name is Lenore. She also has a number, but we call her Lenore. So a lot of the bears that I work with also have been individually identified. And I wanted to just show you this image because it really takes me back, because this is one of the first photos that I ever took of a grizzly bear. It was on my first trip out to Canada way back in 2009. And I came out here to do research, to collect data for my PhD research on the social behavior of grizzly bears. And I was only supposed to be coming out for 3 field seasons, and 12 years later, I'm still here. The PhD is done, but I'm still working out here on this species. So I think that says a lot about how incredible this place is, and also how incredible this species is as well. And I'm often asked why bears. I'm, originally from the north of England, so people are often surprised when they hear that I study grizzly bears. And there's a couple of different reasons, but the main ones being they're really charismatic animals. They're so interesting to watch and to study. They challenge me as a scientist. They're always doing something interesting with their behavior that makes me question, the status quo of what we think we know about bears. And they're really complex and actually quite sensitive animals as well. And as I came to learn, they're completely different to the ways in which they're portrayed in the media. So I like to kind of challenge perceptions with my work, but also develop our understanding of this species, so that hopefully people can, with that learning and understanding, they gain more respect and a more passion to want to conserve them as well. So I've done wildlife research in a couple of different places across the world, including the UK, India, Kazakhstan, and other places in Canada. But year after year, I keep returning to this one place on the west coast of what is known as British Columbia. And that's what we're going to talk about this evening. So I'm going to focus on grizzlies tonight, but of course there are other bear species that you can see if you come to Canada. So of course, Mark mentioned you can see polar bears, you can see American black bears, and you can also see a subspecies of the American black bear known as the commodity bear or the spirit bear that resides in a small area on the central coast of BC. So tonight I'm going to talk about one area in British Columbia. Mark already mentioned about the Great Bear Rainforest, and that's where we're going to concentrate talking about. Now you can see grizzly bears, black bears, and the spirit bears within this one area called the Great Bear Rainforest. And it is the largest tract of connected, or what is known as contiguous, temperate rainforest left on the planet. So it's a really, really special place, really important for biodiversity and also really important for bear conservation as well. And it's kind of thought of as a stronghold for bears within Canada. So we're going to talk about an area in the southern end of the Great Bear Rainforest. And this is just an overview taken from a float plane of what this area looks like. So it's consisted of these coastal fjord type habitats, and with islands, but also the mainland, and completely covered in trees. So that's one of the things that first hit me when I visited this area, is even the tiniest islands are just covered in coniferous trees. So it's quite incredible to see. And so there aren't really any roads that go into this area that you can use to access as a visitor. So you have to come in by boat or by float plane. And if you come by float plane, you get these incredible views of these coastal fjords, and also of the coast mountain range that you can see in the background there. So tonight we're going to talk about one river system in particular, and that is the Glendale River. And this area is also known as Glendale Cove. And this sits just off Knight Inlet, which is one of those coastal fjords. Mark mentioned before about Telegraph Cove. So if you were to go around the corner to the left there and head out to the ocean, you would pretty much meet Telegraph Cove. So we're kind of talking about a similar area here. And this area, Glendale Cove, is within the traditional territory of the Dao-Waitlala First Nation. Now, just around the corner on the right-hand side there, we can see Knight Inlet Lodge. So this is a grizzly bear ecotourism, grizzly bear viewing lodge. And this was actually this was the first lodge-based bear viewing operation on the BC coast. And it is also now 100% Indigenous owned. So that means it's owned by a collective of 5 local First Nations. And the lodge has supported myself and my research colleagues at this site since they began operating in the late 1990s. So there's lots of different tours that you can do if you do come out to the lodge, including scenic cruises. You can do whale watching tours. You can do hikes. But for those tours that are bear specific, you can do bear viewing from small boats, from viewing platforms. It just depends on the time of year that you come. You can even sometimes see grizzlies by kayak. And also you can do walking interpretive tours to learn more about bears as well. So why is this area so important? Why is this a good place to come and see bears, but also for me to study them as well? Well, the main reason is because of the habitat. So when bears come down from their dens in the springtime, they're heading down on the coast anyway, they're heading down into the valleys, and they're coming to estuaries in particular. So they're coming here for the food mainly, and for kind of the spring grow up. And one of the species that they're looking to feed on particularly, we can see in the foreground of this picture, is Lingby sedge. So it looks like grass, but it's a flat sedge. And it's really high in protein for them. So they like to feed on this pretty much all year, but mainly in the springtime and the early summer. And estuary habitats are really important for wildlife on the coast. They comprise only about 3% of the coastline, but they actually support over 80% of coastal species. So really, really important for wildlife conservation. And so this is a great place to see bears on the coast in the springtime. We see them grazing in the estuary and the sides of the cove, grazing on the sedge. Some people have said it looks like cattle. Sometimes you can spot bears here and there just grazing away, and they'll spend hours feeding like this. And it's often not the kind of habitat that sometimes people would associate with seeing bears. Most people think grizzlies and they think rivers and salmon. But in the springtime, this is really the best kind of place on the coast to see them. And it's just a really nice way to view bears. You know, you're sat in a boat watching a bear grazing, and you've got bald eagles flying overhead calling. And it's just like really serene and a really kind of special environment to view them in. Now, when the tides come down, when the tides retreat, bears will sometimes follow those tides and come and feed in the intertidal zone. And they'll be feeding on the mussels and the barnacles, even on the rocks. And you can see some of those in this photo. And they'll also come and they'll flip over the rocks, and they're looking for crabs, small fish, or the small crustaceans that have been trapped under those rocks when the tide has retreated. So you can see this female doing that here. And she's actually flipping quite a small rock here, but some of the rocks I should actually call boulders because they're quite huge, and it's really incredible to watch the size of some of these rocks that the bears are able to turn over. And sometimes some of the cubs will come and try and move the same boulders that their mum had tried to move, and obviously that's not possible. But so yeah, they have a lot of power in their front legs. And a lot of that is down to the fact that the grizzlies have this hump between the shoulder blades. And that hump is actually a muscle that's evolved from the amount of digging that they do for food, but also for digging their dens in the winter. So it gives them a lot of power in their front legs, and that allows them to forage in this way really successfully. Now, spring's also a great time on the coast to see cubs. First-year cubs are at their smallest in the springtime, and they're born in their dens around January, February. So we tend to start seeing them on the coast around May time. So it's a lovely time to see cubs when they first come down from their dens down to start feeding in the estuary. Spring is also a breeding season for grizzlies. So grizzly bears breed from around mid-May till around mid-July. And so this is a really special time because we sometimes get to see these large male bears. We rarely see them at other times of year because generally males tend to stay, large males anyway, tend to stay away from people. So they'll come and feed when people aren't there. But in the breeding season, they're attracted down to the estuaries because the females are there feeding. So we tend to see them sometimes come down, and we'll see like courtship behaviors, lots of interactions, sometimes male to male interactions, sometimes female to female, and of course male and female as well. And sometimes we're even lucky enough to see them actually breeding as well out in the open. So if you do come to the coast to view grizzlies in the springtime, you'll probably be heading out in small boats. So the lodge operate these small flat-bottom skiffs to do their viewing. And these are really great because they can get into some of those more shallow areas. And the boats also have the white electric motor you can see on the back there. So the guides can switch to using the quieter electric motor when they get closer to the bears. So that's really great because it helps to reduce the impact on the bears when they're being viewed as well. Now, another reason why this area is so important for bears is the spawning channel. And so this is an area of supplementary habitat that was built by the Government Department of Fisheries and Oceans, the federal government. And that was built in the late 1980s. To try to bring back the salmon to many different river systems on the coast. And so this piece of habitat was added. It looks quite natural other than the fact that it's so symmetrical, and it connects onto the natural river. And so it provides like optimal spawning habitat for adult fish. So even down to like the flow and the size of the pebbles. So basically, therefore, it allows increased survival of salmon eggs and juvenile salmon. So because the fish are attracted here, the bears are also attracted here to feed as well because of the high kind of concentration of fish in one area. And so if you're viewing bears in this kind of area, you're mainly going to be viewing them from viewing platforms, permanent platforms. And these are a great way to view bears because it gives the bears the free reign of movement wherever they want to go. And it restricts the people. So it's one of the best ways really to view bears. And so if you're viewing in this kind of situation, there's lots of different types of behaviors you may see the bears doing. So you might see some grizzlies feeding in the deep pools. And what they're doing when they do this is they're really looking for dead fish or dying fish. And they'll kind of walk along the bottom with their back legs. And if they find a fish, they'll kind of kick it up and then they'll work it to the surface with their front paws. Now, grizzlies have these very long claws, and you can see in this photo, but they're actually quite blunt, believe it or not. So they're not sharp like a cat's claw. So they can't penetrate the skin of a salmon directly with their claws. Instead, they'll use them for support like we would do our hands. And so you can see this female's kind of feeding on this kind of partially dead fish here in this deep pool. And then next we should have a video. It might just take a few seconds to play. Here we go. So some bears also have these unique fishing kind of tactics, and this female has learnt to dive for fish. So she does a full submerge into the water so that she can access fish that other bears aren't prepared to go and get. That's because most bears don't like putting their heads all the way in the water. There she goes. But you can see by doing that, she gets to find some of those fish that the other bears can't find. And it's sometimes quite hilarious to see her like swim underwater, completely disappear like this. And then she'll pop up like that, sometimes right next to other bears, and completely freak them out. So that's always quite interesting. going to wait for the slide to come back. Other bears will prefer to feed in shallow water. So when they're looking to feed in shallow water, they're mainly looking to fish live fish. Mentioned before about how their claws are blunt. So to catch a live fish, they have to be able to pin the fish to the bottom and then grab it with their mouths. So they need to do this in shallow water. So this can create a little bottleneck, and you can sometimes, in a good salmon year, you can see multiple bears trying to fish in these areas at one time. And when they do that, we sometimes see interactions between different individuals because they're all feeding at quite close quarters. Most of these interactions are really, really amicable. This one, maybe not so much, because this female who has those 4 cubs in the background, which is quite a feat and really impressive, but she is trying to actually steal a fish off this other female. But most of the time, even this kind of thing, if there's lots of food around, it doesn't lead to direct fighting. So we'll often see lots of vocalizations, lots of posturing, the occasional paw swat, but very rarely does it lead to any aggressive interactions. And that's really because it's often quite clear quite quickly in an interaction which bear is a dominant bear and which bear is more submissive. And I think this photo shows quite well how the bear on the left is the more dominant bear, even though they're really similar in size, but the bear on the right is just kind of like taking the submissive role. So bears know quite quickly who's who, and they're able to kind of adapt their behavior around that. So even though these aren't, really aggressive fights, they're always so interesting to see, and I would argue even more interesting to see than direct fighting, because there's so many subtle behaviors and interactions going on, and it's always fun to talk with guests about these kind of behaviors that we're seeing and trying to interpret them. Now, I always think if you're going out viewing wildlife, it's really important to leave not only having seen the animal, but also to learn a bit more about it as well. So for that reason, Night Inlet Lodge offers walking interpretive tours where you can go and learn a bit more about bear ecology and bear behavior as well. And during these tours, you'll look for recent sign of bears. So you'll look for scat on the ground, you'll look for tracks on the ground, you'll look for maybe recent signs of feeding. So sometimes in the summer, we'll see lots of branches that have been pulled down by bears as they're feeding on berries. So we can look for those. You'll talk about things like bear anatomy. You'll look for resting sites of bears. So they're called daybeds. And you'll also look for rub trees on marking sites. And these are some of the areas that we've studied. And these are places that bears come together to communicate with one another. And lots of the knowledge that we've gained on bears in this area and the species in general come from some of the research that has been done at this site. So as I said earlier, our research team have been conducting work at this site since the late 90s. And this has been made possible through an environmental levy that is actually paid by guests when they stay at the lodge. So they get to contribute directly to the bear research and conservation work. And so this long-term funding is really what's kept the project going for so long. And we have had multiple different projects over the years that have taken place at the lodge or in Glendale. So back in the early 2000s, my PhD supervisor, Dr. Owen Nevin, who's just seen in the blue here, he did some GPS collaring of bears, so putting these tracking collars on bears to see how the local bear population moved, so we could look at which areas are more important for bears. We've done a lot of work, and we continue to do work on the impact of bear viewing. So to look at the effect of bear viewing on the presence of bears in the area, but also the behavior of those bears as well. And all this information feeds back into management plans for grizzlies and also for people in the area as well. So we can ensure that people and bears are coexisting. In recent years, we have focused more on what we call non-invasive techniques. So these are techniques that don't require the capture of bears. So two of these techniques that we use are hair snagging, so where we collect fur for DNA analysis, and also camera trapping, so where we set cameras out in the forest and we can collect data on bears 24 hours a day. And these cameras have kind of become one of our focal methods of data collection, and they're really popular for wildlife research on multiple different species. Now, my PhD work concentrated on scent communication behavior for bears. I mentioned that I came to Canada for this reason in the first place. So you can see here 2 examples of what we call rub trees, covered in fur, lots of claw marks, bite marks, lots of sap running down. So really interesting places for bears. And we're just going to see another video now of some marking behavior. So this is at one of our study sites in Glendale. It's a mother with 2 cubs. So this is what they do. They will rub their bodies against trees, and they're leaving scent from their skin on the trees, from glands in their skin. Rubbing them on the trees, leaving that scent mark to communicate with other bears that are in the area. It's always fun to watch cubs marking on the trees, and some of our work actually found that cubs will imitate the mother's behavior at these sites, so you can see that quite clearly in this video. Some of the work that has led on from that, and this again is an ongoing project, is we've been taking samples of that scent that bears leave on rub trees and using human forensic techniques to try to work out what those chemical messages are that are being communicated, so we can get a better understanding of this type of behavior. And one of our focal projects at the moment is the Bear ID project, where we are developing face recognition technology for grizzlies. And we're doing this so that we're able to more consistently identify them and therefore be able to study them and monitor them going forward. And so our research in Night Inlet has been really pivotal to this project because we've collected this large data set of images of the same bears and of different bears over the years. So we're kind of collating all of that footage together now and using that to help train these machine learning networks to be able to identify individual bears. And we're combining that at the moment with camera trap footage so that we can recognize individuals caught on cameras in the absence of people. And the green boxes you see there on the camera show when this individual has been correctly identified. Now, I don't want to keep you too much longer, but I do want to finish off talking about salmon, because salmon are really pivotal to everything I've talked about so far. They are integral to this coastal temperate rainforest ecosystem, and they're really important for food, not just for bears, but also for people, for eagles, for wolves, even for the trees themselves. And that's why sometimes people call these forests salmon forests. And they've also been called the backbone of the BC coast as well. Now, unfortunately, Pacific salmon coast-wide are in decline for a couple of different reasons. And there's some really good conservation projects that have started that are trying to kind of address this issue. One of those projects is taking place in the Glendale River, and it's this multi-year collaborative project between Night Inlet Lodge and the Department of Fisheries and Oceans. So it aims to enhance the salmon numbers returning to this river system. So part of this work involves collecting in a small number of fish from the river. So that's what you can see in that photo. And then the fish are transferred to these holding tanks where they're matured, and then the eggs are harvested, fertilized, and then after some time, those are put back into the river via the spawning channel. And again, this kind of method helps to increase the survival of eggs and juvenile fish, and therefore hopefully helps to increase population numbers as well. And this project is also partly funded by the environmental levy that is paid by guests when they stay at the lodge. So again, get to contribute to this kind of conservation project. And these kinds of research projects, conservation, stewardship work are all really vital to ensuring that this area remains a stronghold for bears and for other wildlife going forward into the future, which is obviously very, very important. And I'm actually going to end it there for this evening, but thank you for listening, and I look forward to taking any questions that anybody might have in the Q&A.
Thanks so much, Melanie. That was absolutely fascinating. Yeah, gosh, so much good content in there. Welcome back as well to Mark and Liz, because we are now going to go into questions. Sorry, everybody, if we're running slightly over. As you keep stressing, there will be a recording sent out. So if you have got your dinner in the oven, don't worry. And sorry, little tickle in my throat. Before we go to questions, we did mention earlier about the £100 Discover the World voucher. I'm delighted to say that that has been won by Douglas Whitaker. So well done, Douglas. And I hope you have great fun spending that on the Discover the World trip, because that is going to be tremendous. So, thinking about Discover the World trips, because gosh, Liz, I mean, we're all so excited now. I know I want to get on the next plane back to Canada. Good grief. It's just making it so much more difficult. So imagine first time visit to Canada. They come to you, Liz, they ring you up, and we say, okay, we want to do, we saw Mark and Melanie's talk, we want to do a visit where we are going to see whales and we're going to see bears. What would you suggest for a first-time visitor who wants to see both?
For a first-timer that wants to see both, but I would imagine probably wants to also see a little bit more of what Canada has to offer as well, sort of, you know, seeing some of the landscapes and scenery, perhaps immersing themselves in the First Nations culture as well. Probably a combination of British Columbia and Alberta would be a good place to start. So head over to Vancouver Island. Obviously, there are fantastic places like Night Inlet Lodge, which my last trip pre-COVID was to Night Inlet Lodge. So seeing those photos sort of really brought back some fantastic memories. Thank you, Mel. But yeah, to head out, you can obviously really immerse yourself for a few days in somewhere like Night Inlet or one of the other lodges along the BC coast. But if you perhaps want to get more of an overview, you can also just head out to Vancouver Island and perhaps do a half-day whale watching trip or a full-day excursion in search of bears. So you don't have to necessarily devote, a whole week or something to the wildlife. You can combine it with other experiences as well. So then perhaps from Vancouver, you could take a Rocky Mountaineer train into the Rockies and spend some time traveling through Banff and Jasper National Park as well and see the mountains as well as the coast. So for a first timer, that's not a bad introduction.
Yeah, that sounds jolly good. Okay, before we get on to more ideas, now, Mark and Mel, both of you, people were commenting on the amazing photos. And we did have several people ask about which cameras you used and what camera lens you used. So, Mark, shall we come to you first? The lens I use for most whale photography is the 100 to 400 mil lens, because it's got a fairly good reach. You've got a bit of flexibility depending on whether the whale suddenly surfaces right next to the boat or it's a bit further away. And often you're photographing from boats, so it's quite hard to hold one of these great big, long, like the one behind me. That would be very difficult to hold on a boat and hold it steady. So that sort of zoom range works pretty well for most whale watching. With things like the narwhal at Pond Inlet, I had a tripod and the whole kit with that great long lens, that I could photograph them a bit further away. But for boat trips, a good range zoom is perfect. Okay, great. Melanie, what do you use?
Yeah, I actually use the same, a 100 to 400. I think I started with a 200, then I got a 300, and then I worked my way up to a 400. But even my lens was secondhand, so I didn't buy it new. So you can get some good deals on the longer lens, but it is nice to be able to get that little bit closer with the photo. But like Mark said, they are quite heavy, so it's sometimes a little bit tricky when I'm in the boats. But yeah, I do use mine's a Canon camera, but I use a 400 lens, and even though it's 100 to 400, I'm often shooting at the 400, so I can get a nice close facial shot.
Yeah.
Now is actually a very good time to get into buying photo kit, because lots of people are changing to mirrorless cameras.
Right.
And I'm doing it myself at the moment, which means selling all your old kit and swapping it for mirrorless, which means all the old kit, which is perfectly good, is coming on the market second hand at very good prices. So if you're thinking about getting into wildlife photography and buying some proper kit, now is a really good time to get some good deals.
Yeah. But Mark, I mean, and although nobody's asked it, as somebody like I've seen whales so many times, but I never get a decent photo, regardless of kids.
Nor me.
So, have you got any tips at all? Just general tips for the average person of how they can actually capture a whale on
oh my
camera?
Goodness, I wish I had a magic answer. Like I said, I haven't got a single photograph of anything that I'm 100% happy with. That I could pick holes in all of them. So one of the pleasures is always trying to do better. But I think it's the same with most wildlife photography. It's getting to know your subject and predicting what might happen. So, you could be on a boat and just react every time anything happens. If a dolphin leaps out of the water, by the time you've grabbed your camera and got it up to your eye and taken the picture, that the dolphin will have died of old age. It takes so long. What you need to do is to watch them. It's very hard, because even now, after all 30 odd years of whale watching, I still get all excited and panic. But the trick is not to do that, to watch and observe. And it's the same with bears and everything, and try and predict what they might do next and be ready for that. So if dolphins you see are racing towards the boat, don't try and photograph the ones that are right next to the boat, but be ready for the ones that are coming. Follow them underwater, or guess where they are, get the speed right. And then the minute they start appearing, you start firing. And like with whales surfacing, you can often predict where they're going to come up. And the best shot is that first split second when more of the whale is visible. So instead of reacting, you're predicting. That's the short answer.
Yeah. Yeah, thank you. And Melanie, somebody's asked, are bears sensitive of their environment? Because the comment was that in your photos, the bears were looking right at the camera. So was it that you were so far away and that was luck, or are they curious? I mean, yeah, how can you see whales looking at you?
Sometimes it's difficult to get facial shots, but that's a good thing, because what we don't want is bears being distracted from feeding and things and just staring at people and boats all the time. So often what accompanies one good facial shot will be lots of photos of the backside of bears. Sometimes they do kind of like turn their back to us, but that's a good thing because it shows that they're comfortable with our presence. They don't feel threatened, so they're comfortable moving around. So yeah, they're very aware when we are viewing them, and we take that into account, and we have distances and things that we don't go closer to, and we have behaviors that we're looking out for. And if we start to see some of those behaviors, that indicates that bears could be, just affected by our presence, then we'll move back and things like that. So, but yeah, so there are some images that I do have, of bears looking directly at the camera, but lots of them just feeding, looking sideways, looking behind, all sorts.
Yeah. Okay, great. And while I've got you, did the wildfires last summer affect the bears around the inlet?
Not so much on the coast, because it's temperate rainforest. We don't really have very bad fires out here. That's more in the interior of the province, because it tends to, we are seeing warmer summers and drier summers, unfortunately, in the Great Bear Rainforest as well. So who knows for the future, but we don't really have too much of a problem on the coast with wildfires, like is the case in the interior of the province, where it does get hotter. So of course, grizzlies in the interior, yes, were probably affected by the fires.
Does it impact, you said about the hot weather, and I was in the Great Bear Rainforest in, was it 2018? And it was very unseasonably warm weather.
Mm-hmm.
And they did say it was more difficult to see the bears, like the spirit bears hadn't come out yet because it was so warm.
Yeah, sometimes if it's really hot, if it's like a really, really hot day and a really high tide, so that there's not much estuary exposed, so therefore not much food, sometimes bears will go into the forest and just sleep till it gets cooler. But that's, that's only really in kind of like the heat of the day. We'll still kind of see them in the mornings and, potentially in the evenings as well. And then also sometimes if it's hot, they'll come down to the water and they'll just bathe in the water as well. We've seen that, where they'll just come and sit in the water, sometimes swim around a little bit. So we can still see them, but it does have an effect when we're seeing these kind of more extreme weather patterns.
Yeah, sure.
Mm-hmm.
So Liz, we've had a question here about seeing whales on a cruise up the Inside Passage during September. And I noticed you also in the chat box earlier on mentioned about taking an expedition cruise where you might see narwhals. So, yeah, do you want to give us a couple of ideas about cruises?
Yeah, certainly. I mean, there's a couple of options. I mean, the Northwest Passage cruise is a great opportunity to really explore the Canadian Arctic. Some of the places that Mark mentioned earlier, so sort of going past Baffin Island, and then Beechy Island, Somerset Island. And there is the thing with an expedition cruise, it's not like, obviously if you go to somewhere like Night Inlet and you want to see bears, or you want to go to see polar bears, we'd say go to Churchill, because that's where there are bears in concentration. And although we would never guarantee seeing wildlife, you've got a really good chance of seeing them there. Going on an expedition cruise, or even, I mean, I took one of the BC Ferries along the Canadian Inside Passage, and the chances of seeing wildlife, you may or may not see wildlife. It's going to be more sort of scattered, but you also get that incredible opportunity to just see a really vast area of different landscapes. You get to see the Arctic tundra, you get to visit some of the Inuit communities up in the north. And then there is a good chance that you could see narwhal, belugas, polar bears. There's all sorts of different wildlife that you can see along the way as well. So it's just getting that combination right. And we would always, say to someone, what is your primary goal for going? Do you want to see a variety of things, or are you very specifically wanting to see one species and that is the reason for going? So, and then we would piece that together for them.
Yeah, and we must stress when we use the cruise word as well, we are talking, as you say, expedition cruises.
Yeah.
These aren't floating gin palaces with.
Definitely not. One of the best trips I've ever done to not just to Canada, to anywhere, was a week sailing through the Great Bear Rainforest, sort of along that coastline. And during that trip, we saw, I don't know how many grizzly bears, we saw orcas, we saw porpoise, but we also saw otters. And then we also spent a strange amount of time looking at some of the rock pool creatures, some of the starfish and the anemones and the urchins. And that was absolutely fascinating. And obviously, before we went, we were all talking about the bears and the whales and, the big things that you're going to see. But the opportunity to see some of those smaller creatures as well in such a spectacular setting really made that trip special for us. So, yeah. And that was sort of 16 people on a boat. So, yeah, very much the small group experiences.
Yeah, great. Mark, I know you've got a lot of experience of expedition cruising, but somebody has asked, is there an effect on the whales from the cruise lines?
Yeah, it's a really good question, and I mean, I could talk about this for hours, as we all could. It's a big issue at the moment, and I think the honest answer, it depends, and it depends on three things. It depends on the size of the ship, how many ships are working in the same area, and how the trips are run. And I think there's a balance to be had where you have smaller ships, and I'm very much against, not just in the Arctic, but the Antarctic particularly, very much against big ships taking hundreds of people to these places. If you keep the ships smaller, are numbers limited, and you number the number of ships that are allowed to operate in a particular area, and they're run responsibly, then I think there's a balance to be had where the ecotourism can benefit the local places by giving them a value and educating people about them and the conservation aspects and so on. I'm very much against just unregulated, free-for-all, mass numbers of people visiting these places, because they're very delicate places. And if it's done badly, then yes, it can definitely cause harm. But I think the kind of trips that Liz has been talking about are the right balance, where you have smaller numbers of people, very carefully selecting where you go to, and limiting how and exactly where you land and how you conduct yourselves when you're ashore.
Absolutely. And I think we can't stress enough, and it's why Wanderlust works with Discover the World, for instance, that it's so important to choose the right tour operator who work with the right partners on the ground. Absolutely. Just
because something's called ecotourism doesn't make it good. There are good operators and there are bad operators, and Discover the World is one of the good ones, where it is done responsibly, and the people running them actually care about the wildlife, not just about running trips and making money.
Exactly. But it's so sad we're running out of time, because I've got so many questions here, and we are going to have to round up in a couple of minutes. One last question for you, Melanie. How old do bears live to? We haven't actually said that. We've heard that narwhals can live to over 200, but how old are the bears?
Well, average lifespan in the wild is said to be around 20 to 25 years of age. But there have been bears documented over 30 years of age in the wild. So we think around mid-20s is about normal.
Okay. Oh gosh, so many questions. You know what? We should have split this out, shouldn't we? Over 2 evenings or something. There's so many things we could ask. But we really are going to have to round up. So just as a reminder to everybody, we will send out a follow-up email, and we will put in some of the places certainly that were mentioned, some of the whale species that were mentioned, some of the facts from Melanie, a bit more information and useful links from Discover the World, because I know you'll want to see what they can do, because there's so many great itineraries that they can do. And also, oh gosh, well, there's so much that we could talk about, so we can't. Oh no! So I think to finish, what I'm going to ask each of you, and it's a really difficult question, I know, but if there's just one amazing wildlife experience in Canada, you'd say to people, if you're going to go to Canada, you really, 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 really must do this. Then I would. What's it going to be? I know it's so hard. I know it's really unfair. And Liz, I know, because I know it's impossible, and I know Discover the World as well can offer so many amazing experiences in Canada. But I don't know, what would you suggest for just, if you really had to narrow it down to one unmissable? There are genuinely too many, but to cover somewhere that we haven't dwelt on so much this evening, I would recommend a trip to a lovely little island called Carpoon Island, which is just off the northern tip of Newfoundland, and it sits on the edge of Iceberg Alley. So you can go there and you can sit there with your cup of coffee or your large glass of wine, because it's about that time now, and you can watch the icebergs float off the shoreline there, and the humpback whales breaching amongst the icebergs. And I think that's a pretty special place to go and visit. So that's my totally agree. I've been to Iceberg Alley and I completely agree. And Newfoundland, it's just so stunning. I know, again, we could do a whole chat about Atlantic Canada.
We're doing Newfoundland next time, shall we?
Yeah, let's. There's so much there. But no, absolutely right, to take us back to that East Coast and all. And of course, it's not that far from the UK, is it? It's an easy flight.
Exactly.
And
there's so much more there to see and do as well. You've got all the Viking history and the incredible geology. So it's fantastic hiking. So there's a lot to do. And complete contrast to the West Coast. So,
absolutely. Mouth-watering idea, that one. Okay, Melanie. I think this one might be less of a surprise.
Yeah, I'm so biased.
What are you going to recommend?
I'm going to say come to the Great Bear Rainforest. It's an incredible place, not just for the wildlife, but for the scenery as well. And I think it ticks so many boxes in terms of like large charismatic animals, such amazing landscapes to see. And I would recommend, if possible, to come and stay with an Indigenous-owned company.
Brilliant, great idea. Yeah, because we haven't talked about the people, the Indigenous people
Exactly.
either. So I know this needed to be a half day, really, didn't it? So, last but not least, Mark. And this must be really difficult for you.
I don't want to answer this. It's impossible. I agree with both Liz and Mel, both of those. I mean, I think if you wanted to get a general experience of some of the best wildlife Canada has to offer, I would have to agree with Mel, the Great Bear Rainforest, because you've got the spirit bears, the black bears, the brown bears, the grizzlies. You've got everything from bald eagles to, wolverines, and you've got fantastic whale watching. You've got humpback whales, killer whales, fin whales, Pacific white-sided dolphins, gulls, porpoises, and amazing, amazing wilderness. So, and you can start the whole trip off with the ultimate day, which I think would be in Vancouver. You can go bear watching in the morning, whale watching in the afternoon. You can see a movie or Shakespeare in the evening. I mean, there's not many places in the world you can say that. So start there and go to the Great Bear Rainforest. I think it would be hard to beat that. But then about 20 other places are coming. I'll shut up because I could list off loads more.
I know. We really must. Oh, I know it's impossible. We really must go. But no, great suggestion. And actually, in our Wanderlust Reader Awards, which were announced last week, British Columbia actually won our top region in the world for our readers. So perhaps not a big surprise there.
No.
That was incredible, guys. Thank you so much. I see there's lots of love in the chat box for the talk tonight. You all did such a brilliant job. I only wish we had another hour or two that we could talk in. We're going to have to reconvene sometime. But thank you so much to Mark Carwardine, to Melanie Clapham, to Liz Lunnon of Discover the World. That's been tremendous. And thank you all for watching. Thank you
very much.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone.
Good night.